Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. zaLinuxDev here with my first ever tutorial, and I thought it good, seeing as this is my first tutorial ever, to actually do a tutorial on installing Ubuntu or any other Linux distro for that matter on your computer, because you can't really do development on Linux if you don't have a distro running. There are many different distros to choose from. You can choose from Manjaro, you can choose from Arch, you can choose obviously Ubuntu, you could choose Solus Linux, Debian, OpenSUSE. However, I tend to stick with Ubuntu because it seems that it is the, for me at least, it's the easiest to work with. So that's why I use it. Ubuntu obviously being a derivative of Debian. It's based off of Debian, but nonetheless, let's dive into it. So the first thing you're going to want to do if you want to install Ubuntu on your computer is you're going to want to go to the website ubuntu.com and click on desktop over here, and then click on download Ubuntu, the button over there, and you will see that there are two different variants listed. I believe this is going to change pretty soon, and I will explain why this page. So the reason why I think it's going to change is that currently we have a long-term support version of Ubuntu called 16.04, which is I think it's Xenial Xeris. Ubuntu 17.10, I'm not 100% sure what that is. I think it's something Aardvark, Artful Aardvark. So the difference between the LTS and the regular download of Ubuntu is that the LTS obviously stands for long-term support. So those versions of Ubuntu tend to be a little bit more stable, and they tend to be a little bit more polished, whereas the other versions of Ubuntu like 17.10, 17.04 and 16.10 were actually development versions, so they were cutting edge. Well, not 100% cutting edge, but they were more cutting edge than 16.04. Obviously, running more recent software has its caveats, and I prefer not to do that. However, it must be noted that currently I am running over here Ubuntu Bionic Beaver, which has not been shipped yet. It is currently in beta. It is going to ship on the, I believe it's the 26th of April. And once that in fact gets shipped, obviously that'll be the new LTS. However, I'm running it currently because I just like to be on the cutting edge of things, and it is quite stable. I believe and I feel that it is even more stable than Ubuntu 17.10. So that's why I am running it. You will notice here that it says, when you read, it says download the latest LTS version of Ubuntu for desktop PCs and laptops. LTS stands for long-term support, which means 5 years until April 2021. That is when support for 16.04 will officially end. So obviously Bionic Beaver, I am not going to speak on behalf of Canonical, but if we go by their record, it should be supported until April of 2023. Anyway, so you can either download it directly via HTTP over here, the ISO image, or you can download via torrent. You could even run 17.10 if you really want to, but as I said, I do not recommend that. So once you've downloaded the ISO, which I have already done, obviously it should be downloaded to your downloads folder, and I'm going to show you how to create a bootable USB stick from that ISO that you've downloaded. So in Ubuntu or in any other Linux derivative, it's quite easy actually, any other distro, to create a bootable memory stick. If you are running Windows, I would I would recommend downloading Rufus, which is a little program that makes it easier to flash ISOs to memory sticks and make a memory stick bootable. But in Ubuntu or any other Linux distro, like I said, it's going to be quite straightforward to do it, and I will show you how to do that right now. So I'm just going to plug in my USB stick here. If I can find the hole, there we go, there's the port. So you'll see that it's already mounted, and in fact it is already flashed, but I don't care about that. I'm going to reflash it just to show you guys what you need to do. So first off, you're going to start the terminal by pressing Ctrl-Alt-T, or alternatively going into your start menu or launcher and just starting up terminal. Once you've done that, I'm going to cd into downloads, cd obviously being for change directory. I'm just going to list the contents of downloads. You'll notice that I've already downloaded Ubuntu over there. It is the older version of the Ubuntu LTS. You'll notice that it is .3 instead of .4, but the changes are so small that it doesn't really matter. At this stage, you can just update while you're installing or even after you've installed it. Let's go ahead and show you how to flash to the memory stick. So there is a command that you need to run in Ubuntu or in any other Linux distro. It's called lsblk. I believe that stands for list block devices. I'm not 100% sure. Anybody can correct me. Feel free to correct me in the comments if you actually know any better. What this does is it lists all the storage devices in your computer. So if I run that, you'll notice that I have a loop 0 there. That is for Ubuntu Snap, and it's the core application for Ubuntu Snap, which is a new version or a new way to install packages in Ubuntu. Then I've got my SDA, which is my main hard drive, and that is a 256 odd hard drive SSD. It does get recognized as a 238 gigabyte, but that's obviously because of the industry standard versus the actual standard. Then you'll notice that I've got a 32 gigabyte memory stick there on SDB. So to create a bootable memory stick in Ubuntu, like I said, straightforward. Now that we know that our memory stick is on SDB, what we're going to do is we're going to go sudo, which stands for superuser do. What this does is it drops you into the root account so that you have administrative access so that you can in fact execute certain commands. You cannot, for instance, just write straight raw to SDB without running sudo. In fact, let me show you what happens when you try and do that. So the command that we're going to be running to actually write to the memory stick is dd. I believe it stands for direct data or data direct. I'm not 100% sure, like I said. But nonetheless, that is the command that we run. And if for input file and equals, and I'm going to type U and press tab because Ubuntu has this nice autocomplete feature. So you'll notice that it populated the Ubuntu ISO file for me over there. That's because I'm already in the downloads folder and it knew to do that for me. OF, which stands for output file, and I'm going to say equals, and I'm going to run /dev/sdb. Remember, I'm running this without super user privileges, which means that permission is going to be denied. So if I want to actually write to the memory stick, I need to prepend this with sudo. What that's going to do is it's going to ask me for my root password, and I'm going to input that now, and it's starting to write to my flash drive. So while it's doing that, there are a few things that I want to mention to you guys. So first off, I'm not going to be obviously rebooting my computer because I need to be able to record what I'm doing, and for me to do that from the BIOS is going to be a bit difficult. But what you would do is once we are done writing this file to the memory stick and having it made bootable by this dd command for us, we would reboot our computer and we would go into our BIOS bootloader settings and or boot order as it is called, and we would choose the relevant device, which in this case would be my memory stick. Each motherboard has a different way of doing this. Each BIOS has a different way of doing this. So my suggestion would be to actually go ahead and Google if you're uncertain about how to access your bootable disk for your specific motherboard model and BIOS revision, and just boot into it once we're done. Another thing that I want to mention to you guys is that certain distros of Linux have different distros of Linux have different ways of actually writing to disk. So as I'm looking at my memory stick at this moment, it is still flashing, which means that it is still writing. So you will notice in a minute or two that this terminal window over here is going to change, and it is actually going to show here that it's done writing. However, you should actually have a look at your memory stick and just check whether it is in fact done writing. Like for instance now, the program claims that it's done writing, but if I have a look at my memory stick, it is still flashing. And that is because Linux writes to a buffer, or at least Ubuntu does, writes to a buffer before it actually transfers whatever data is being written to your memory stick. So it's always wise to wait until your memory stick is done flashing, which it's done now, and then rebooting. Otherwise, you're going to have half of your ISO file written to your memory stick, and you're going to wonder why you're unable to boot into it. That being said, like I explained earlier, I am going to be installing Ubuntu into a virtual machine, and the reason for that is that I want to be able to record it for you guys. So I am going to be telling my Ubuntu, or rather my virtual machine, to just boot straight up off of the Ubuntu ISO. And we will run the installer from there. So let's start the virtual machine. You'll notice that it's starting to boot. Okay, it might take a little while, but it shouldn't take too long. So this is what you would see once you've actually started booting off of your memory stick from the BIOS. Okay, so we are greeted with a desktop over here, and we are going to be supplied with two options, and those options are try Ubuntu and install Ubuntu. So these are two different ways of actually installing Ubuntu, or rather, as the name states, you can try Ubuntu without installing it. However, you can install Ubuntu from try Ubuntu, which is what I'm going to be doing because I want to demonstrate this to you guys. So, interesting thing about try Ubuntu is that obviously you can install Ubuntu from it, and while you're installing Ubuntu, you can in fact browse the internet and mess around, which is why I prefer using the try Ubuntu method. However, install Ubuntu is quicker in the sense that you don't have to physically boot into Ubuntu. It just actually brings up the installer window within the current session. But I'm going to show you guys how to do this from the try Ubuntu, just because that's the way that I usually do it. So I'm going to click try Ubuntu. And you'll notice that it actually boots into a full Ubuntu session. So this is what we call a live session. So if you're unsure about whether you want to install Ubuntu on your system, you can go ahead and run this session. You'll notice that we've got an icon over here that says install Ubuntu. That is if you in fact then at the end of the day decide to install Ubuntu. However, if you just want to try it out, you can do that from here. You've got the full experience. You can start, for instance, Libreoffice Writer, which is the Word program, the document processor for Ubuntu, the open source version of Word from Microsoft. So we can browse the web, like I said, using Firefox, which is also pretty cool, while we're installing Ubuntu. I'm not going to be doing that right now, obviously, because I want to show you guys how to get this up and running. One thing that I tend to do when I'm installing Ubuntu is I tend to not enable networking. So as you can see, I just clicked there, disable networking, because I don't like my computer reporting data back to third parties. And what Ubuntu has started doing is, I don't know exactly when they started doing this, but it's been a few years already, is once you actually install Ubuntu, they start collecting some data about your install process and your experience. And along with that data, they send a few things that are quite concerning to me. For instance, your IP address and your CPU, your make and model of your computer, your screen resolution, whatever, a bunch of different things. And those things can be used to identify you, or at least your computer. And I tend to not be in favor of that. So I usually just disable my networking as soon as I can, or I don't even try and log into a Wi-Fi hotspot. The reason why I was automatically connected over here is because I'm connected in my host session, and obviously the VirtualBox automatically connects to that interface. Alright, so we are greeted with this welcome screen once we double click on install Ubuntu, and we can choose our installer language. We can go Espanol, we can go Francais, Italiano. Different languages are available. However, I think the easiest one is English, but you can localize your installer if your language is available to you. Click continue on this screen. So you'll be taken to this screen next, where you can decide to download updates while installing Ubuntu. So you don't have to do this. You can do the updates after installing Ubuntu, but if you do click this, you will automatically download the updates as it suggests, and it will actually be right up to date once you are done installing, which is pretty cool. Then the second option here is install third-party software for graphics and Wi-Fi hardware, Flash, MP3 and other media. So if you click this, which I usually do, but tonight, just for time-saving purposes, I'm not going to do that. If you select this, what happens is you get, alongside with your free open source operating system, you get some proprietary software and drivers installed, which means that nobody except those companies that are in control of these proprietary sources actually have access to the source code thereof. So in other words, what this means is that the Wi-Fi hardware driver that is going to get installed, for instance, if you click here, Intel has that code, and they have not open sourced that code, and nobody is able to read that code. So if you're a pure open source guy, don't install the third-party software stuff. But for me personally, I don't really mind it that much, because it's usually it's stuff that you're required to use to run your computer, stuff like drivers, etc. Flash I don't really like. I usually remove that after installing, but I do install the third-party software. So you can run MP3 and like I said, graphics drivers and Wi-Fi drivers and stuff like that. So click continue. Over here you're going to be greeted with the installation type screen. So what the easiest way to install Ubuntu is erase the disk and install Ubuntu. However, if I had Windows installed on this virtual machine already, which I don't because I don't like Windows and the way they're going lately, but if I had Windows installed on this virtual machine, there would be an option here that said install Ubuntu alongside Windows. And if you selected that, you can do something pretty cool. You can in fact then dual boot Ubuntu and Windows, which is pretty awesome, because that means that you can boot into Windows if you want to run your games and stuff that are incompatible with Ubuntu or Linux, and you can boot into Linux if you don't feel like using your Windows operating system. But I prefer, being a bit of a more of a pure Ubuntu or Linux guy myself, I prefer to just erase the entire disk and install Ubuntu as is stated over here. The other thing that you can do, which is a bit of more of an advanced thing, is you can click something else here and you can create and resize partitions yourself. This is a bit more advanced, and I'm not going to be covering that in this tutorial, however. So I'm going to go ahead and say erase disk and install Ubuntu, and click install now, and it's going to pop up with a window that tells me what it's going to do to my hard drive. So it's going to say that it's going to create a partition as ext4, which is going to be my root and home partition, which is where the operating system and all my configuration files are going to live. then it's also going to create a swap partition. So what a swap partition is in the olden days when RAM was a bit more expensive, like in the DOS days and the early Windows days. I believe Windows actually, I don't believe, I know that they still have swap. They just don't call it swap. They call it a page file. So what swap is basically is once your computer starts hitting a certain amount of memory consumption, usually in Linux operating systems by default 60% of your RAM, if you consume 60% of your RAM, it starts writing stuff that's cached into your swap drive or swap file. So it's sort of like a virtual memory space on your hard drive, if you would. So I would recommend leaving this on unless you have very many gigabytes of RAM. However, if you have a solid state drive, you should probably consider setting the swappiness of your swap to something less hardcore, something like 10%, which means that as soon as you have 10% of your memory left, you're going to start writing to the swap file, which is actually a lot better because, you know, SSDs have limited writes and reads. Obviously, mechanical drives also have limited writes and reads, but it's not as bad as SSDs. So, but I'm not going to be showing you how to do that in this tutorial. Maybe in the future in another tutorial I will. But for now, we're just going to move on and we're going to click continue. Okay, we're greeted with another screen over here where I can choose my locality or my wherever I am in the world. And obviously, you know, zaLinuxDev, I'm in South Africa, so I'm going to click Johannesburg and continue. And now we're going to be greeted with a screen where we can choose our keyboard layout and our languages. So I'm going to click English South Africa and English South Africa. And now we can test our keyboard over here. So if you have selected a different keyboard layout, you can make sure that all your different buttons do what they're intended to do. So I'm just going to click continue. And here is where we're going to set up a little bit more information about our computer. And so your name, I'm going to type LinuxDev. And your computer's name, I'm going to call this LinuxDev computer. And username, I'm going to say LinuxDev. In fact, let's make this computer name zaLinuxDev so that I can demonstrate something later on. Then you can choose a password, which I'm going to choose a very simple password for now. And over here you can decide whether you want to log in automatically or require your password to log in. I'm going to leave it as require my password to log in because that is obviously the smart thing to do. However, you can set it to log in automatically, which means as soon as you turn on your computer and it boots into Ubuntu, you're already running inside your session. You don't have to type a password, which obviously is a little bit less secure. But if you're into that sort of thing, living on the wild side, you're welcome to do that. Then we've got the option to encrypt our home folder if we actually have our password required to log in. What this is going to do is exactly what it says. It's going to force anything that you write into your home folder, which is usually configuration and apps and stuff that you install as a local user for yourself. It's going to encrypt that information. And if your laptop ever gets stolen or somebody gets access to your hard drive by taking it out of your computer or something, if they do not have your password, they won't be able to get to your documents and your configuration and all the things that you have saved in your home folder. So this is quite a smart thing to do if you are a little bit more concerned about data privacy. However, it does have a performance impact, so I usually just leave it unticked. So if I click continue now, we are going to start installing the Linux system. And this should actually be fairly quick because I'm not connected to the internet and I'm not installing any third-party software or any third-party drivers, and I'm not downloading any updates. So you saw that by clicking on this little arrow key, we can see many things happening which makes no sense to most of us. I don't even always know what the heck is going on here myself. The guys that actually build the distros have a lot more knowledge about what's happening here. I have a little knowledge about what's happening here, but you don't have to concern yourself with that, luckily. So we'll just wait for the installation to complete. While that's running in the meantime, I'm going to mention something else. As soon as this is done installing, I'm going to boot into, obviously, Ubuntu on the virtual machine, and I am going to just run a few commands, just because, like I said earlier, I'm a bit of a privacy nut, and I don't like the fact that my computer reports back to Canonical what I'm doing, when I'm doing it, what apps I'm running, and what my IP address is, and when I'm online and when I'm not online. So we're going to be doing that as soon as we boot into Ubuntu. It's quite a simple command to run. And then something else that we also need to take into account is that we will need to enable the firewall, because by default Ubuntu, a fresh install, does not have the firewall enabled. So I'm going to show you how to do that as well. Something else that you can do once you've installed Ubuntu is you can in fact go ahead and change your desktop environment. You can install the Gnome desktop environment. There's KDE Plasma, there is LXDE, there's XFCE, there's many different desktop environments. Basically what those are is it changes the look and feel of your install. So right here we are running, I believe this is still the Unity desktop. However, I know that with the Bionic Beaver, the new version of Linux, this shell has changed obviously to Gnome, but it's still a little bit more Unity-ish, so I don't really like that either. So I prefer to just straight up install regular Gnome, as you can see right here. This is in fact the Gnome desktop, and I think it is pretty awesome. I don't really like this Unity desktop, but whatever you prefer, nobody's here to judge you. That is the great thing about Linux, is that you have a lot of choice and you have a lot of control over what you do. So you'll notice that the installation is completed, so I'm going to click restart now. Once I click restart now, I'm going to be told that I need to eject my installation media and press enter. What's going to happen then is we're going to reboot our system, in this case, which is a virtual system, just for this demonstration. If you've installed this on your computer, obviously your whole PC is going to restart, and we will be presented with this login screen, which is called LightDM. You can even customize this in Linux. So currently I am running the GDM login screen, which a lot of people don't like, but I am of the opinion that if I install a desktop environment, I just rather use the login screen or login tool that gets promoted with it. So that being said, let's log into our session here. So I've entered my password, and we should be greeted with our desktop pretty soon. First thing that I'm going to do immediately, I'm going to disable my networking, like I said, because I don't like Ubuntu reporting back to Canonical what I'm doing. And I'm going to press Ctrl-Alt-T, which is the shortcut for starting a terminal. And you'll notice over here, this is the username that we created when we did the install, and this is our host name. So the host name is the computer name. So if you're going to be search for this laptop or this computer on the network, this is what would show up, zaLinuxDev. Or you could obviously use the IP, but that's basically what that is for. This is the user that is currently running. So seeing as we're running as Linux dev at zaLinuxDev, that means that we don't have super user access, right? So certain things we can't do. So the command to purge or remove packages from an Ubuntu install is apt remove, and then you would type the package name. In this case it would be popularity contest, which is the application that monitors what apps you install and what apps you use when and how often you use them and how you use them, which is a little dodgy to me. I get that they're doing this because they want to promote the software that is the most popular into their software center, but I prefer not doing that. And then also app port, which is the application that reports back to Ubuntu various other things, among others, like when your computer crashes or you have a crash, which doesn't happen often in Linux, but it does happen, and we use app port for that. One cool thing about Linux that I need to mention is that actually if you have a crash of an application, usually the rest of your computer is fine, because of the way that it handles multitasking. It doesn't do it like Windows, where if your one application crashes, the whole computer goes to hell. It just crashes the single application, which is pretty cool. So you don't lose work, you just lose the work that was in the application that crashed. But like I said, that doesn't happen a lot. Something else that I want to mention is apt remove. Just removes the application or the software that you are specifying. So I don't prefer doing that because software usually comes with a little bit of configuration. So I just usually do apt purge, which would in fact remove the configuration as well. I know that a lot of other guys online on YouTube say to use sudo apt remove. I prefer sudo apt purge because I like having a more clean desktop environment and a more clean hard drive. If you do a purge, once you decide to reinstall the software, obviously you're going to have to redo the configuration for that software that you reinstalled. But usually when you remove something, you want to actually remove the configuration as well. So that's why I do it. Remember to do a sudo in front of this command because we need to run it as super user, as root, because we are actually busy tampering with installed applications on the system. So I'm going to press enter my password, and press enter again and say yes, I want to purge these applications from my life. Now they are deleted and gone forever, so we can go back online if we really feel like doing that. So I'm just going to do that. We should be safe now. The other thing, one last thing that you need to do is sudo Ufw Enable, because like I said earlier, Linux distros usually don't have the firewall enabled by default. So if you say sudo Ufw Enable, it's going to enable the firewall and it will keep it enabled once you reboot. You don't have to run that every time you boot into your system. Obviously the inverse is true as well, so you can disable the firewall if you want to. I'm not going to be teaching you all the ins and outs about opening ports, etc. on the firewall. I'm just going to show you that that's the way you enable the firewall, and I would in fact advise you to do that. This blocks ports from accessing dodgy third-party sites and dodgy third-party sites from accessing your ports. So anyway, guys, that's it. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and remember to click the little bell icon to be notified of my next tutorial, which is going to be all about the different IDE packages in Ubuntu and in Linux. Because obviously this channel is about Linux and development as well in Linux, so we are going to be having a look at those packages. So IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment, and that is the software that we usually use to write programs and websites and do all the awesome stuff that we plan on doing. However, that is the next episode, and I hope you look forward to it. I hope you enjoyed this one. Like I said, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and thank you so much for your support. This is zaLinuxDev signing